There is, in the Jewish tradition of education and training of rabbi, I believe I'm pronouncing it correctly, the Havruti school of training in Scripture. And it's something that always fascinated me when, as seminarians, we had the chance to go to the Holy Land and not only learn about the places where Jesus walked and preached, but also the people who lived there, the Arabs, Jews, Muslims, Christians, Catholics, many people who for generations lived in that land. But the Havruta style of teaching was this. Instead of being like how we are used to as Americans in a classroom and a lecture style, certainly there is some instruction, but it's two people who are paired together, hopefully friends, but not necessarily, and they sit across the table from each other, both with the same passages of Scripture, and they argue with one another. Imagine education by argument, disagreement, contradicting one another. Supposedly, sometimes they come to a consensus, but the goal, the expressed goal of that style of education is that two people holding opposing sides in order to bring out something more true, better, deeper, than if we are just stuck in the tunnel vision of our own mind. Beyond that, many of you may be familiar with the phrase devil's advocate. Devil's advocate is not some anti-Christ-like title. It actually comes from the Catholic Church. Devil's advocate comes from the history of naming saints in the church, a medieval institution in which someone was assigned to try in every way imaginable to disprove the holiness, the credibility, the worthiness of this or that individual to be called a saint in the Catholic Church. And so in the very structure of our model of sainthood, there is this notion of not only advocacy, but of someone who is actively against something. Moreover, in medieval scripture study, something I came to be fascinated with more and more in my time in seminary as I learned, is that there was a certain credence given to contradictions in Scripture and in life. Their core principle was that if Christ was the origin, the beginning and the end, the source and perfection of all things, then in some way there must be a connection even in seemingly irreconcilable contradictions. And you saw that principle taking place not only in literature, poetry, scripture commentary, but even the sciences, of trying to take things which were completely other and opposite and contradictory with one another and trying to make sense of them together. Moreover, to frame what I want to reflect on with you even more clearly, how much of our lives are filled with contradiction, but in which that same contradiction gives meaning and purpose and clarity to our life. There are many such examples, but I'll give you one. Imagine sickness and health. Nothing in our experience, at least in our emotions, could be further from one another. But isn't it also true that being sick makes us truly value what it means to be healthy? And if we have crossed from one side to the other and back again, do we not also have a unique position of empathy or sympathy to those who suffer, especially if we have suffered in the same way? That suffering and sickness and illness oftentimes not only give us a unique perspective, but a powerful way to connect with people rather than us just agreeing on something or being the same in something. It gives us a deeper insight into the human condition. So I hope that I framed all of that in some way, that not only in the history of our faith and education, but also in life, contradiction, resistance, arguments are not only a part of life, are not only essential to life, they are important to the flourishing of human life. Why is it then that we see things like today of Jesus sending out people two by two? Is there a purpose? Is there something good about that? We see in all of the Gospels, the apostles routinely argued with one another, disagreed with one another, and even Peter was so bold as to argue and disagree with Christ himself. If you recall the moment when Jesus said that he had to die on the cross, and Peter said that I would rather kill whoever came after you, and God forbid you should die in such a cruel way. And even Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are thinking as man does, and not as God." That notion then, in our faith, contradiction, adversaries, arguments, resistance, do you all see that as a part necessary for the growth of your faith, the improvement of your faith, and yes, even the flourishing of your faith? There is a wisdom in Jesus sending out people two by two. It's always a great thing when husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, friends agree with one another, have complementary personalities, are easy to get along with, are easy to love. But oftentimes, when things are going too well, isn't it more of a false sense of security than reality? Isn't it usually the case that there are little disagreements, things that irk and annoy us, that bubble under the surface, that frustrate us and keep us from being what we think is really happy? When in reality, having those conversations of disagreement in a spirit of respect, in a spirit of love, always. Aren't those the healthier moments? Aren't those the moments where we actually feel more alive and more ourselves? And to have that reciprocation of someone who's able to receive those words, not in hatred, not in anger, not in disgust or disdain, but in mutual respect. Isn't that also a part of human flourishing? I say that, as you recall at the beginning of Mass, I mentioned the convocation. When you're in seminary and when you're in the priesthood, you're, for lack of a better word, sort of an alpha male in a room full of alpha males. I'm not to say all priests are aggressive or macho or anything like that, but when you're studying in the seminary, you're working your hardest to be your best, around other people who are working hard and to be your best. And oftentimes in seminary, there is constant conflict, disagreement of how to approach a subject, how to be your best, what to emphasize and what to prioritize. And for those of you who know Father Fedek very well, I've known him now for 15, 16 years as a college seminarian, and then together with him as associate and priest. Many of you, I'm certain, have no idea how often Father Fedek and I argued with one another here at this parish, in our house, at the dinner table, about the right way to do things, disagreeing with each other. I don't think we ever got to the point of yelling. I don't think I've ever heard Father Fedek yell, but I yell. But we yelled at each other. But because I valued him so much as a mentor, as a friend, as a brother priest, there was never that disagreement or anger or anything directed at him in a way to degrade him, because I knew from my heart, as my pastor growing up, as a young man, as his associate, as his friend, I knew where his heart was, that he always worked from a place of great love for the church and trying to do his best with what he thought was right. But even in that relationship, there is disagreement and conflict. But because of that, I feel at least, I was able to become a better priest. I think even he was able to become a better priest because of that relationship rooted in faith and trust and love, but yes, in conflict. In our faith, what do we see in the world? Some of our Eucharistic prayers teach us and tell us, how do we bring the light of the gospel into the world? How do we express our faith in a world? Take all the many things that we've seen this past year, Think of all the disagreements in our culture. COVID, Black Lives Matter, Roe versus Wade, everything. How many conflicts exist in our country and in our world? How are we supposed to be the light of the gospel? Arguing, anger, division, creating, exasperating it? Or rather, much like our scripture today, is it better to listen or to speak? What is the greater action of love? To reconcile or to divide? There's so many ways that we could go about it. But if we are truly going to be sent out into the world, as our gospel talks about today, what are the actions that we're going to take? We all have feelings, and strong feelings about a variety of subjects that you care about, that I don't, that I care about, and you don't care about. But at the core of everything, from these forms of education in the seminary and in the history of our faith, our intellectual tradition, our cultural tradition, if it is not rooted in the core principle that God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son to suffer and die for us, and that everyone is beloved, that everyone is precious in his sight, and that they deserve that love from us the same way that God freely gives that love. And in that spirit of respect, in that spirit of love and of faith, no conflict can overwhelm it. No conflict, anger, disagreement, argument can destroy it. It's up to us. We see how the world acts. If you disagree with me, I'll destroy you, take away everything from you, remove you from my sight. I never want to talk to you again. Does that sound like the Christ who reconciled us, even though we, because of our sin, were enemies to God? No. Jesus, all the same, became sin for us, became a contradiction to God himself. God contradicted himself out of love for us. Let that be a lesson. The contradiction is not a sign of the falsity or stupidity of God, but of the great depth of his love, and we have a lot to learn. Let us therefore trust in Jesus Christ, enter into the depths and the contradiction and the darkness of this world, and be that light that brings his love and peace to every heart.